Welcome to everyone here this evening. Glad to have you. My name is Julie Schumacher-Cohen, and I am Assistant Vice President for Community Engagement and Government Affairs here at the university. And it's my pleasure to get us started tonight and then to turn things over to colleague and project partner Glynis Johns of Black Scranton, who is responsible for bringing our guest speaker to Scranton. First, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants and nations of this land, the Lenape, the Munsee, the Shawnee, and the Susquehannocks. May we be ever mindful of their legacy and contributions and the ongoing impacts of colonization and racism, and commit ourselves to building relationships to steward this land with care, compassion, and justice. So the lecture and conversation this evening is the last program in the theme focusing on Black history and experience as part of the Scranton Story, Our Nation's Story project. Some of you may have attended a film screening or the event focusing on Black history and housing in February. Over the last year and a half, we have sought to explore a multifaceted story of Scranton, with a focus on underrepresented narratives and histories that expand how we understand ourselves as Scrantonians, and by extension, as Americans. As always, I want to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities for their support of this project. We are honored to have with us tonight Dr. Julius Fleming, Jr., author of Black Patience, Performance, Civil Rights, and the Unfinished Project of Emancipation. We do have copies of his book, and he will be signing them afterwards, so you have that option after the event. We are so glad to have him in Scranton. I think he likes Scranton. You may be back, not the first time. In his book, Dr. Fleming explores the history of Blackness as being, quote, at once a violent history of waiting and a radical refusal to wait, end quote. He underscores the gap between injustice and emancipation that hails from the days of chattel slavery to today's continued struggles against anti-Black racism and white supremacy. So tonight we'll have a chance to first hear from Dr. Fleming about his book and how it reconsiders the civil rights movement from the perspective of Black theater and performance. And then he will engage in a conversation with Glynis and Dr. Melissa Anyiwo, faculty in the university's history department, and then we will open it up for Q&A with all of you for audience participation. So I'm going to briefly introduce Glynis and Dr. Anyiwo, and then Glynis will more fully introduce our guest speaker. I did want to take a moment also to recognize that it's International Women's Day. So shout out to all the women, and especially our two women tonight who are both doing important work. So first, Glynis Johns is CEO and founder of the Black Scranton Project, a local heritage initiative dedicated to archiving and celebrating Black history and culture in Scranton. Glynis is a graduate of St. John's College with her bachelor's and master's in sociology. Her work has been recognized in numerous ways, serving on the Governor's Commission on African American Affairs, being honored by U.S. Senator Bob Casey, and most recently featured in a mini-doc on the institutions preserving Black history in Northeastern PA, which won a regional Emmy Award. Woo! I'm always grateful to work with Glynis, and the Black Scranton Project has been a key partner on the Scranton Story Project over the past 2 years. Dr. Melissa Anyiwo is an associate professor of African American history here at the university and part of the new Black Studies concentration here at the university as well. She received a BA and PhD in American Studies and Politics from University of Wales, Swansea in the UK before coming to the United States. Her dissertation provided an analysis of the life cycles of the dominant stereotypes of African American women. She has served as an assistant professor of history at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga and as full professor at Curry College, and at both institutions she coordinated their Black Studies minor. So I am looking forward to an insightful evening with Julius, Glynis, and Melissa, and now I will turn things over to Glynis.
Well, good evening, everyone. It is so cool to see such a full room here tonight. Thank you all for coming to this very special event. I'm so happy to introduce our guest tonight, Dr. Julius B. Fleming, Jr., who earned his doctorate in English and a graduate certificate in Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. He specializes in Afro-diasporic literatures, culture, and he is particularly interested in the performance studies, Black political culture, diaspora, colonialism, and especially where they intersect at race, gender, and sexuality. Professor Fleming is the author of Black Patience, Performance, Civil Rights, and the Unfinished Project of Emancipation. The project reconsiders the civil rights movement from the perspective of Black theater, while also examining the importance of time and effect of making the modern race order. Analyzing a largely unexplored transnational archive of Black theater, it demonstrates how Black artists, activists use theater and performance to unsettle the demands of a violent racial project, in his terms, Black patience. From the slave castle that holds the slave ships, from the auction blocks that command the go slow in fighting segregation, Black people have historically been forced to wait, coerced into performing patience. This book argues that the civil rights movement, Black people who cry for freedom now, at the lunch counter in the streets, and importantly on the theatrical stage, disrupted the historical praxis using Black patients to manufacture and preserve anti-Blackness and white supremacy. Professor Fleming is also beginning work on a second book project that explores the new geographies of colonial expansion and their impact on Afro-diasporic literature and cultural production. Fleming's work appears in journals like American Literature, American Literary History, South Atlantic Quarterly, Callaloo, and the James Baldwin Review. Having served as an associate editor for Callaloo, he currently serves as associate editor for Black Perspectives, the award-winning blog for African American intellectual history. Fleming has been awarded fellowships from the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation and the Mellon Foundation and the University of Virginia's Carter G. Woodson Institute. I'm so excited to have him here to talk about his book. Before we jump into that, I did want to say that I found Black Patients to be really transformative for me, adding language to some of the things that I do in my day-to-day work with the Black Scranton Project, and why I felt like it was important for me to get out there and create a community center, a community space. And so I'm super excited to have Julius here, and we welcome you to Scranton, to the Black Scranton community, and Scranton at large.
Good evening, everybody. How's everybody doing? Good. Thanks, Glynis, for that warm and kind introduction. I'd like to thank all of you all for coming out this evening. It means a lot to me that you're here. To have so many people here and so many Black people here, frankly, it means a lot to me. I don't know much about Scranton, and most of what I know comes from Joe Biden and him always talking about being a Scranton boy. But since I've been here, it's been absolutely amazing. I feel like I have friends, and I'll certainly be back and certainly be meeting people in Philadelphia to hang out more. I also want to thank Carolyn and the staff here at the University of Scranton for bringing me here, for giving me a place to stay, for feeding me and all those important things. And another thank you to Glynis, because Glynis really is the impetus behind my visit here. We met at the ASALA conference, and I follow Glynis's work online. So I had an idea of the work that Glynis is doing, but actually visiting the space today and actually seeing what you're building is nothing short of amazing. And I'm going to find a way to invest in it, and I hope everybody here finds a way to invest in it. You're a treasure to this community and to this nation, to the world. So thank you so much, Glynis. And finally, I want to thank Julie for all of the work that she did to get me here. Again, Julie was kind over email, but spending time with Julie today, oh, there you are. Spending time with Julie today just really sort of put icing on the cake. So thank you so much for everything. So I'm going to keep this talk somewhere between like 35 and 37 minutes because I want to give most of the time to the conversation and also to your questions. But what I'll do is to talk kind of in general about my concept of Black patience. And then I'll spend some time talking about how Black people during the Civil Rights Movement used theater to resist Black patience. Then I'll close by sort of meditating on the lingering presence of Black patience even in our present day contemporary moment. Right. So with that said, I'll just jump right in. So in a 1992 television interview, journalist Charlie Rose asked Black writer Toni Morrison to share her thoughts on Rodney King, a Black man who was brutally assaulted by members of the Los Angeles Police Department the year before Morrison's interview with Rose. In the course of this now iconic instance of police brutality, the officers viciously beat, kicked, and tased King, who was unarmed. Unbeknownst to them, their vicious attack was being recorded by an amateur videographer whose film of the incident appeared on televisions around the world. igniting rebuke and outrage throughout global communities. Despite this recording, however, each officer charged was acquitted. Within hours, Black communities in Los Angeles began to riot in order to express their resistance to this gross miscarriage of justice, and more than this, to challenge the historical persistence of those racial practices that have enabled these and other officers to enact such performances of anti-Black violence with impunity. With these events in mind, Charlie Rose turns to Morrison and solicits her, quote, take on Rodney King and Los Angeles and all that experience. Let's take a listen to Morrison's response to Rose's question.
Your take on Rodney King and Los Angeles and all of that experience?
The most remarkable thing to me about Rodney King and what happened afterwards was people kept saying, oh, this terrible explosion, oh, the riots, oh, this is awful and could have been avoided, or what is it about? What struck me most about the people who were burning down shops and stealing was how long they waited. The restraint, not the spontaneity, the restraint. You realize the moment to be anarchic was when we saw those tapes. When we first saw those tapes.
They waited for justice.
They waited. How long was that? 9 months? A year?
Yeah.
They waited for justice almost a year and didn't come. No one talks about the fact that no one ran out into the streets as I wanted to. I was sitting in there with my son. It was like a ballet. It was unbelievable. And I think everybody felt that way. And they didn't do a thing. They waited. That's amazing. That's amazing to me.
But what do
At the heart of Morrison's answer to So at the heart of Morrison's answer to Rose's question about the beating of Rodney King is the significance of time, and specifically of waiting, not only to this savage display of human disregard, but more broadly to the shape and the experience of Black life and Black freedom. They waited, Morrison explains. They waited for justice, and it didn't come. In this powerful meditation on Rodney King, Morrison puts her finger on the pulse of a vital historical connection among Blackness, freedom, and time. As 1991 Los Angeles waited for justice that, as Morrison puts it, didn't come, they joined their ancestors and Black people across the African diaspora who at every turn have been forced to wait for freedom, to wait for justice, to wait for citizenship as white supremacy has worked to reinforce the global infrastructure of anti-Blackness. From enslaved Africans who were forced to wait in the belly of the slave ship, to those who were forced to wait on the auction block, from those who were forced to wait for emancipation, to those who were inundated by calls to go slow in the civil rights movement, waiting has routinely been weaponized as a tool of anti-Black violence and civic exclusion, one designed to control Black people and to ultimately limit their freedom. In my first book, I named this violent history of racialized waiting, Black Patience. By Black patience, I mean a large-scale racial project that demands performances of waiting among Black people as a way to invigorate and reinforce anti-Blackness and white supremacy. On this front, I think the origins of the term patience might be instructive. Derived from the Latin word patientia, which means suffering, pati, which means to suffer, the performance of patience is at root a performance of suffering. Further, when considered in relation to the violent histories of suffering that have targeted Black life for more than 4 centuries, from slavery and Jim Crowism to lynching and mass incarceration, the racialized exigencies of patience become clearer. So in a word, what I am suggesting is that Black patience is a violent racial project, one that uses time, and more specifically waiting, to shore up the structures of racial power at the heart of our global communities. In the final analysis, Black patience works to delay and to ultimately deny Black freedom. They waited for justice, Morrison laments, and it didn't come. Within this context, we can certainly understand why Black anti-colonial psychiatrist Frantz Fanon described Black being or Black people's existence in relation to the wait. Quote, "If I were asked for a definition of myself," Fanon writes, "I would say that I am one who waits." In my first book, Black Patience, Performance, Civil Rights, and the Unfinished Project of Emancipation, I analyzed the long and brutal history of Black people being forced to wait for freedom. And I examined how these conditions of coerced waiting have strived to render the Black subject, as Fanon puts it, as one who waits. To do this work, I turned to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, a movement most commonly known for its radical refusal to wait or its insurgent demand for freedom now. As the civil rights movement unfolded, the thick tension between the violent demands of Black patience and Black people's radical resistance to those demands came to a boil, fueling a deadly battle to determine if Black existence would be grounded in the violent logic of Black patience on the one hand, or in the radical time of freedom now. By 1954, when the U.S. Supreme Court offered a nod to outlawing racial segregation in public schools, the weaponization of Black patience had become one of the most powerful tools in the arsenal of anti-Black violence. As some people scrambled to maintain a world that would remain grounded in the social, political, and financial economies of slavery and the unthinkability of Black citizenship, they turned to the slow time of patience to engineer a post-slavery mechanism that could delay, which is also to say, to crush the eventuality of Black freedom and full citizenship. On this front, we can consider a sobering example from white Mississippian and Nobel Prize-winning writer William Faulkner. Rattled by the court's 1954 decision to integrate public schools and its instruction to carry out this ruling with, quote, all deliberate speed, Faulkner turned to the pages of Life magazine to issue a stark warning to Black Southerners. As their demands for freedom now began to crescendo in the wake of the court's ruling, Faulkner warned them to, quote, wait now, stop and consider first. I would say to the NAACP and all the organizations who would compel immediate and unconditional integration, go slow now, stop now for a time, a moment. By responding to Black people's radical demands for freedom now with deceptive calls to, quote, go slow and to wait, Faulkner used Black patience to stall and to hopefully annihilate Black people's political desires to become full citizens and to do so now. While it might be tempting to dismiss Faulkner's demands for Black patience as the violent rantings of a racist white Southerner who hails from all places, Mississippi, and I'm a native Mississippian, so I know how Mississippi circulates for folk. When I moved to Philadelphia from Mississippi, people were like, oh my God, how did you survive Mississippi? Are you okay? Did you wear shoes, right? And a part of the thing is that Mississippi is everywhere, right? Anti-Blackness is not limited to Mississippi. So it might be tempting to read Faulkner as somehow exceptional, right? Some racist white Southern man. But Faulkner was not alone in his deep commitment to the racial project of Black patience. He was joined, in fact, by the likes of United States President Dwight Eisenhower. For instance, on October 4th, 1957, against the backdrop of tensions animating the Cold War, the Soviet Union launched the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, a technological accomplishment that stoked enough fear that it motivated Eisenhower to sign the National Aeronautics and Space Act on July 29, 1958. This act authorized the birth of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which we know as NASA, and equipped it with a hefty budget of $100 million. With this intense Cold War conflict on the rise, outer space became a new frontier in a heated battle to expand U.S. empire into spaces that were once beyond human contact and to execute these spatial expansions at record speeds. By placing his seal of approval on this congressional act, Eisenhower used the gravity of U.S. presidential power to shore up the nation's desires to move through space more freely and more quickly. But the president brought a strikingly different time-space thinking to bear on the civil rights movement and Black people's similar efforts to eliminate spatial barriers and to acquire freedom now. At a July 17, 1957 press conference, Eisenhower, an otherwise committed advocate of eliminating space-time barriers, lamented, quote, "I personally believe if you try to go too far, too fast in laws in this delicate field that has involved the emotions of so many millions of Americans, you're making a mistake." Therefore, as civil rights activists were working to eradicate the time-space barriers imposed by anti-Blackness and white supremacy, and here I'm thinking, for example, of racial segregation, Eisenhower was trying to pump the brakes on those ambitions and to thereby cordon off Black people from the national project of revolutionizing time and space in this post-war era of social and political change. In fact, the president's demands for Black people to wait or to be patient were routinely headlined in newspapers across the nation with titles such as, quote, "Eisenhower bids Negroes be patient about rights," or "President urges patience in crisis." And so we also have to keep in mind the backdrop against which Eisenhower makes these comments, right? So we not only have spaceships going into outer space at record speeds, we also have the kind of financial infrastructure of the world changing where money can move between countries at record speeds, right? We also have the invention of television, right? Where newspapers can circulate at record speeds. So essentially what's happening is that there's a global speed up, right? The world is literally speeding up at the same time, ironically, that the president and not only with William Faulkner are both asking Black people to slow down, right? And we can see the problem with that. From writers like William Faulkner to Dwight Eisenhower, white people have routinely insisted that Black people, quote, "not go too far too fast." They have historically demanded that Black people wait and go slow. They have forced them to perform Black patience. While writing my first book, I watched, listened to, and studied this global symphony of demands for Black people to be patient. At the same time, though, I was as attuned to the creative ways in which Black people were using their own bodies to contest the violent operations of Black patients. Many of you, to be sure, are familiar with the now iconic photographic and televisual images of Black people in the civil rights movement using their bodies to resist these calls for Black patience. The marches in the street, the sit-ins at the lunch counter, the speeches at the churches, the singing at the courthouse, the jail-ins at jails and prisons across the country, all of these embodied performances of civil rights protests congealed to offer a defiant and resounding hell no to white supremacist demands for Black patience, and to cultivate a political ethos that energized Black people's insurgent demands for freedom now. Black theater, I argue, was crucial to these efforts. Though an understudied dimension of civil rights memory, Black theater was a vital node of the movement and a crucial form of Black political protest. It is my contention that the civil rights movement was acted out on the theatrical stage with the same creative innovation, political ambition, and embodied skillfulness that were hallmarks of the sit-ins, the marches, and the other more familiar embodied performances that are routinely prioritized in civil rights history and memory. If the civil rights mantra, freedom now, was one of the most salient phrases in the movement's political vocabulary, Black theater was a critical site for this urgent and radical refusal to bow down to the violent demands of Black patience. Part 2 on theater and the civil rights movement. In 1963, as Black people celebrated the Emancipation Proclamation Centennial, or 100 years of legal freedom from chattel slavery, they routinely staged Lorraine Hansberry's classic play, A Raisin in the Sun, which is still perhaps the most popular play by a Black American playwright. I'm curious, how many of you all know of A Raisin in the Sun? Yeah, most of the room, right? Still the most popular play, right? Guided by Langston Hughes' prescient question, quote, "What happens to a dream deferred?" the play allowed Centennial audiences to ponder America's deferral of their own Black freedom dreams, to recognize that an entire century after emancipation, Black people were still waiting for freedom. When the curtains close on A Raisin in the Sun, audiences find the Youngers, a Black working class family, still waiting for a series of futures, career futures, housing futures, and political futures that never come to fruition within the dramatic present of the play. Sitting in their cramped, overpriced apartment, awaiting the arrival of movers who will help them transition to their new home, they stand, quote, on the edge of these futures, as Walter Lee, the family's son, might put it. but they never actually inhabit them before the play concludes. For instance, although audiences witness the Youngers packing and preparing to move from their roach-infested apartment into a new home, into an integrated neighborhood, and in many ways an integrated nation, the materialization of this dream is left hanging in the balance, looming in the time of the not yet here. We never actually see this Black family move into that home. Therefore, even as white theater critics routinely and almost obsessively describe Hansberry's play as, quote, triumphant, it nonetheless ends with the Youngers trapped in the same deplorable, segregated housing project that was a deep source and constant reminder of their oppression. Like Black people in 1963 America, the Youngers were left to wait for their freedom. They were forced to perform Black patience. Further, we are told throughout the play that Black families like the Youngers, who moved into segregated all-white neighborhoods, were habitually bombed. Even if this particular Black future were to arrive then, the threat of Black death still loomed on the horizon. Throughout my book, I show how canonical Black playwrights and civil rights activists like Lorraine Hansberry, Langston Hughes, James Baldwin used plays like A Raisin in the Sun to energize the civil rights movement and to expose and critique the violent cultures of Black patients. But in the time I have remaining today, I want to turn to a lesser-known group of theater workers who, though not as widely known as those canonical figures, also used theater to shape the civil rights movement and to challenge the racial project of Black patients. I also have to stop to give a shout out and thank you to Glynis's aunt who donated her bottle of water for this talk. So thank you. This would not be possible. So I want to turn now to the Free Southern Theater, which is a vibrant grassroots theater that emerged, as fate would have it, from the very grounds of Faulkner's Mississippi. Founded in 1963, the Free Southern Theater was crucial to the cultural and political fronts of the civil rights movement, as the theater's more well-known and celebrated counterparts were marching, sitting in, and using other modes of embodied performance to demand freedom now. The Free Southern Theater was likewise harnessing the power of bodies and performance to contest the violent operations of Black patients. In choosing Mississippi as its primary site of performance, the Free Southern Theater chose land that was haunted by legacies of slowness and anti-Blackness, land that I would argue exists as the United States' most iconic geography of Black patients. When Denise Nicholas, a Free Southern Theater actress, arrived in Mississippi, quote, alone and scared, she felt that she had, quote, landed on another planet or stepped back in time. Mississippi was, for Nicholas, an unearthly geography ensnared in a primitive sense of time. The state certainly registered in this way for Black singer and civil rights activist Nina Simone. In her now classic civil rights anthem, Mississippi Goddamn, Simone meditates on the storied geographies of Black suffering that make up the U.S. Deep South. Draping her sharp condemnation of racial violence in the garb of a show tune, she sings, quote, Alabama's got me so upset, Tennessee made me lose my rest, and everybody knows about Mississippi, goddamn. This paradigmatic rendering of Mississippi as the essence of anti-Black racial violence is also at work in Malcolm X's claim that the United States should, quote, get Mississippi straight out before we worry about the Congo. On yet another occasion, the leader argued that Mississippi is, quote, anywhere south of the Canadian border. As Simone's Mississippi Goddamn and Malcolm X's speeches suggest, during the civil rights movement, Mississippi was a well-used emblem for the scale of anti-Black violence plaguing the Jim Crow South and the United States more broadly. This Mississippi was certainly alive when the Free Southern Theater pitched its tent in Mississippi during the civil rights movement. Like scores of college students and recent graduates, Free Southern Theater founders Doris Derby, Gilbert Moses, and John O'Neill embarked on a risky journey into the belly of the Jim Crow South, lending their time and bodies to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. When the trio collaborated to establish the Free Southern Theater, however, they added a new weapon to the arsenal of civil rights activism in Mississippi, Black theater. Excited about the possibility of introducing Black Southerners to live theatrical performance, the founders crafted a general prospectus for the establishment of a Free Southern Theater. This founding document frames the organization's emergence as a pivotal addition to the movement, the theater would, quote, open a new area of protest and add a necessary dimension to the current civil rights movement through its unique value as a means of education. In a special report on the Free Southern Theater, the Council of Federated Organizations, a coalition of major civil rights groups, also emphasized the theater's connection to the movement. It concluded, in fact, that the Free Southern Theater was as much, quote, a product of the movement as voter registration, community centers, or the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. As these observations and the company's prospectus suggest, a major component of the theater's mission was to integrate theatrical performance into an already robust cultural and political landscape of civil rights activism in the U.S. South. Like the lunch counter, the bus, the voting booth, the street, the theatrical stage became a site of embodied civil rights activism. I'm just going to skip ahead a bit so we have plenty of time for Q&A. So part of what happened is that the theater was founded at Tougaloo College, which is my undergraduate alma mater. It's a historically black college in Mississippi. And so the reason it was founded there is because Tougaloo is a private historical black college. And so Jackson State was 10 minutes away, but it was public. So what would happen is that anytime there was any student protest, the state could pull its money, its funding from the school. Because Tougaloo was private, there wasn't that threat. So we have stories, when I was in the archive in Mississippi and Louisiana, we have stories of theater participants literally being chased by the police and making it to the gate of Tougaloo College and then throwing their bodies over the gate because the police could not come on the grounds of that private college, which did not stop the state, though, from trying to revoke Tougaloo's charter, though they were unsuccessful. So the theater is founded here at Tougaloo College without much money. They wanted actors, dancers, singers, directors, technicians, and importantly, they issued a call saying that we still need $15,000, y'all. We need angels. A part of being broke, essentially, and not having a lot of money, though, meant that they were innovative in terms of the stages that they selected, right? So a far cry from Broadway or sort of lush theater houses, they noted that their stages would, quote, be community centers, schools, churches, and the fields of rural Mississippi and of the U.S. South. As one might imagine, the mission of organizing a radical black Southern theater in Mississippi was a brave and dangerous undertaking. Only 3 weeks after the theater began, there was the murder of a group of 3 civil rights activists whose bodies were found in a dam in Neshoba County, right? And the reason these activists were stopped is for allegedly speeding. But the real problem, though, is that we know that they were trying to move too fast toward their freedom, were trying to resist the violence and closures of black patients, and the FBI in Mississippi labeled this case Mississippi Burning. I want to share another example, right, of Free Southern Theater actors who had just left a performance, this time in Macomb, Mississippi. And what we learned from the actors who kept journals during these performances is that a bomb was actually thrown at the stage in Macomb, Mississippi, right? So imagine being a troupe of actors and having someone actually throw a bomb at the stage, right? So as dangerous as a lunch counter sit-in, as a jail-in. On one occasion, though, a group of actors was leaving a performance and they were stopped by a police at gunpoint. The police didn't interrogate them about a crime, but they asked them questions like, quote, "What are you doing down here, pretty boy? How is that black pussy? And how does it feel to screw a white woman?" Finally, releasing the trio at approximately 2 a.m., the police alerted the Ku Klux Klan that, quote, "2 nigger lovers and a nigger were loose, so pick them up for us." For 3 hours, the actors endured what they call abject terror, crawling along country roads, hiding in weeds, and dodging the beams of the Ku Klux Klan's flashlights. They clawed against meeting the fate of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. By some grace of fate, the actors managed to elude physical harm, though not without a visceral reminder of the dangers haunting the state that the Free Southern Theater had chosen as a site of performance and a radical stage of civil rights activism. So I want to pivot now to what was the theater's kind of most iconic play in terms of its resistance to black patients, and that is Samuel Beckett's 1952 classic, Waiting for Godot. How many of you know this play? Yeah. I know that the theater profession knows it. So it's a weird play, right? It's a play that still confuses me. When I teach the play, I'm like, I think I understand it, but I'm not quite sure if I understand it. And I have a PhD in English, right? So imagine this Black Southern play producing this particular play, not only in Mississippi, but in the rural Mississippi Delta, right, where the average education of the Black Southerner at this point is the 8th grade, right, because people couldn't go through 12 grades because of sharecropping demanded their labor, doing what would be school hours, right? So they decide to stage this play for a primarily 8th grade, in terms of education, 8th grade audience, right? And this is a play that has long been used as a kind of site of protest, right? In Sarajevo, in Japan. There have also been productions by all Black cast, right? But the production that really inspired the Free Southern Theater was the production at Alcatraz prison, right, in San Francisco. And what they said was that this play would be, quote, readily understood and welcome in that larger prison, Mississippi. Right, that's a quote from that. They thought Mississippi was worse than Alcatraz and that this play could do something about it. The theme of waiting at the heart of Beckett's plot, though, accorded with and underscored the game of waiting for full citizenship that Black Southerners have been playing for over a century in Mississippi. The central conceit of Waiting for Godot is that Vladimir and Estragon, Beckett's two protagonists, are trapped in a cycle of waiting for the arrival of Mr. Godot. Estragon, he said he should be here. Vladimir, he didn't say for sure he'd come. Estragon, we'll come back tomorrow. Vladimir, and then the day after tomorrow. Estragon, possibly, and so on. Interestingly, the duo is anticipating the arrival of a person who has made no promises to come. But even in the face of their uncertainties about his impending arrival, they agreed to return, quote, tomorrow, and then the day after tomorrow, and so on, entering a seemingly incessant cycle of waiting and patience that holds no guarantees for Godot's anticipated arrival. In the course of their dialogue, Vladimir asks Estragon where he had spent the previous night and learns that Estragon has slept in a ditch. He queries further, and they didn't beat you? Beat me, Estragon replies. Certainly, they beat me. Even with Waiting for Godot's dizzying, disjointed, and sometimes hard to follow modernist plot, Free Southern Theater audiences experience a live theatrical performance that mirrors so much of their own realities of everyday violence, whether inhabiting deplorable spaces or performing patience while enduring waxing and waning hopes for social and political change in the U.S. Deep South. The Free Southern Theater's production of Waiting for Godot baffled and even failed to entertain some Free Southern Theater audiences. And this is an image of a Free Southern Theater audience. You can see just how many people came out. You can also see that they're in a cotton field, right? So they literally meant that the cotton fields of Mississippi would be their stage. Penny Hartzell, a Free Southern Theater actress, noted in her journal that Godot, quote, mystified, amused, bored, and shocked many of those who experienced the play. In fact, some audience members even registered their disappointment in the play by walking out before the play ended. And this is a point that people often like to emphasize, which is that Black Mississippians, Black Southerners walked out of the play because they didn't understand it. When the play opened in Miami in the United States, people walked out of it. Well-educated white people walked out because they too were bored and didn't understand it, right? So there's nothing exceptional about Black Southerners in this instance. But in some cases in Greenville, Mississippi, for example, a group of children hated the play so much and found it so boring that they started throwing spitballs at the stage and at the actors to register their dissent. But for many of the theater's audiences, however, Beckett's play was so important because it resonated with their own histories and experiences of waiting for something that does not come. Of particular note was the audience's reactions to Lucky and Pozo, two characters who play a master-slave duo. Bound by a rope throughout the play, Lucky, the slave, is doltish and subservient and caters to the demands and caprices of his master, Pozo. Weighing in on this relationship, one, quote, Negro lady in the audience exclaimed that, quote, the reason why we keep talking about slavery is the rope. It has great significance. Another Black woman in the audience noted that Lucky and Pozo, quote, made me think of slavery. I took the rope off my neck by thinking for myself. For many audience members, Vladimir and Estragon's fruitless patience index how the United States routinely used Black patience as a way to defer Black people's acquisition of freedom and full citizenship. As one youth in the audience put it, if the Negro never moved, it'd be like these people waiting for Godot. This point was certainly not lost on legendary Mississippi civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer. At a 1964 performance of Godot in Ruleville, Mississippi, Hamer declared during intermission, quote, you can't sit around waiting. Ain't nobody gonna bring you nothing. You got to get up and fight for what you want. Some people are sitting around waiting for somebody to bring in freedom just like these men are sitting here waiting for Godot. Later, Hamer cautioned the audience to, quote, pay strict attention to the play because it's due to waiting that the Negro is as far behind as he is, As this example demonstrates, during the civil rights movement, Black artists and activists used theater to lend their voices to Black people's clarion calls for freedom now, and to thereby resist the violent cultures of Black patience, boldly contesting the historical demand for Black people to wait for their freedom. And I'll conclude with this part. On Black patience now. In this very moment, as I move toward closing this lecture, Black people across the nation are still waiting for Congress to pass the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, an act that would make their right to vote a little safer. As I move toward closing this lecture, there is a Black woman who has to wait longer to get to work because gentrification and redevelopment have displaced her from her home. As I move toward closing this lecture, my mom, my dad, and other residents of the primarily Black city of Jackson, Mississippi, the Blackest city in the nation per capita, are still waiting for clean water. As I move toward closing this lecture, Black people, more than anyone else, are forced to endure the violent wait times of imprisonment, while often waiting longer to receive a speedy and fair trial. Black people are forced to wait longer for kidney transplants, emergency room visits, loan applications, updated textbooks, for government assistance as the waters of Hurricane Katrina filled their Black lungs that days before had produced the very air, the breath for the trumpets and trombones, the tubas and jazz songs that have made New Orleans an American treasure. What I am suggesting here is that Black patience is not a racial project of bygone days. It is now. It remains a part of the fabric of this nation, the fabric of this world. So when we ask Black people to wait and to be patient, we need to understand those demands as part of a much longer continuum that has weaponized Black people's patience against them, putting it in the service of their own undoing. Let me end with a short clip from James Baldwin.
What is it you wanted me to reconcile myself to? I was born here almost 60 years ago. I'm not going to live another 60 years. What is it you wanted me to reconcile myself to? I was born here almost 60 years ago. I'm not going to live another 60 years. You always told me it takes time. It's taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brothers and my sister's time, my nieces and my nephews' time. How much time do you want for your progress?
Thank you all so much.
Well, thank you again, Julius, because that was incredible. We are going to have a little Q&A back and forth. It's open discussion, so we don't have to be so quiet anymore. Feel free to ask us some questions, and yeah, we can just dive into it.
Hello, everybody. So I just wanted to ask Julius. So firstly, the text itself, the reason why I think you should all go get it, is that as a historian, it's really hard to find ways to bring the past to life, particularly when things are told over and over again. And I think one of the things that I just was so charmed by in your book was how it reinvigorated my interest in the civil rights movement, how it really took a look at something that I knew so well, but took it from a very different perspective. The one thing I wanted to address that we didn't get to here is the notion of sit-in and jail-in. So I was wondering if you could say those two for you in the context of this book, and then how that really does show the weaponization of Black patients.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that question. So I'm a fan of studying the sit-ins and jail-ins, right? And we all know what those were during the civil rights movement. Part of what I was recognizing, though, is the way in which, when especially leftist historians were studying the movement, like the sit-in wasn't radical, the jail-in wasn't radical. In order to go back and really kind of locate a radical civil rights movement, we need to go back to the 1930s, and we need to go back to communism. So part of what was happening is that a primarily white group of leftist historians were saying we should go back to a primarily white group of communists to really locate radicalism. And my question then became, what's not radical about saying to the state that I am so invested in my own freedom that I'm willing to spend 6 months in jail, to lose my job, to trouble my relationship with my husband or my wife or my partner, to leave my children motherless for 6 months, to endure all the repercussions, right, that come along with that. What is not radical about that? So a part of my interest in kind of turning to the jail end and the sit-in and the end of the book, so I spend the whole book saying, Black people are refusing to be patient. They're resisting the violent cultures of Black patience. But in that chapter that you're talking about, I say, but look how they use patience in radical ways. Look how they wait in that prison. Look how they wait at that lunch counter, right? So when people are having ketchup and mustard poured on them and white aggressors are using cigarettes to burn them, that was not the only act of violence, right? In order to prepare their bodies for the sit-in at the lunch counter, they burned each other with cigarettes. They pulled each other's hair so that they can discipline themselves in order to be patient in the moment of live performance, right? So there were these cycles of teaching the body to be patient, but to be patient in radical ways. And I think the sit-in and jail end really show us that.
I guess in terms of wrapping it up too with the clip from James Baldwin, I thought it was really powerful because I will say one thing that drew me to your book the most is kind of based off too what James Baldwin was saying. It's how long are we gonna have to wait? When is it going to be enough? And thinking about some of my own work and being hey, we can't wait for community centers. We can't wait for other people to tell our stories. We need to get out there and do it ourselves. How much longer do we need to wait? And then what happens if we stop waiting? What is that also? I think because it plays into a little bit of fear, what happens if you don't step out of this boundary of patience of waiting and then step into the space of radicalism? It could ultimately be violent, but it also could be productive. And I think that's something that we don't also take the time to think about. So,
yeah, the fear of sitting in an uncomfortable space, the fear of changing the way that you live, and the fear of the consequences of changing the way that you live. Building on that question, I'm curious. I guess I know the answer, but I'm curious to know why it is we need this belief that Black people should sit and wait when we have these other movements where it's okay to be violent, it's okay to push for change, it's okay to demand change. But whenever it comes to Blackness, suddenly it's that you're pushing too fast, you're moving too fast. Why do you think that white supremacist society needs to keep that idea that we should be slow, we should wait, we should?
I'm trying to think. I have a politically correct answer. I have an honest
answer.
I see the camera.
Thank you.
The truth is, in some ways, I understand white people's historical desires for Black people to move slowly and to wait for freedom. Our very existences in this country, our origins are as objects of property. We were not persons. We were not human. And then we were exploited labor for centuries. So in some ways, I understand sort of how in the wake of emancipation, someone can say, okay, you've been an object for centuries. Give white people a chance to kind of make that cognitive transition to see you as a person, right? To see you as a citizen. So that's my generous reading of it, right? Which is to say that they need time for that cognitive shift, that mental shift, to see me not as an object, but as a person. But I think the more truthful analysis has to do with what one scholar who's recently passed away, her name is Lauren Ballant, and she talks about what she references as cruel optimism, right? And we know that optimism means to hope. But for Ballant, a part of what's so cruel about optimism within liberal democracy is that you hope, but that progress actually never comes. Right? And so I think this is a part of what goes on with Black people and Black patients, which is that you do enough to keep us hoping, but that real structural change hardly comes. And so when I teach my students, I teach them there's a moment after the Civil War where we have this decade of progress, Reconstruction, right? We have Black senators from all places, Mississippi, go figure, we haven't had any since. But there's this real hope. And then it's not by accident that we get lynching and rape and the chain gang. We get the civil rights movement. It's not by accident that we get rollbacks and affirmative action and all these conservative moves. We get Barack Obama. It's not an accident that we get everything else that has happened since Barack Obama, even as we thought we were living in a quote-unquote post-race society. So I think a part of what Black patience does is to give Black people enough optimism to be cruel, but to then ultimately fall back into those same structures of oppression that have been at the heart, not only of this nation, but of the modern world.
And thank you for explaining that, because I feel like that's something I've been trying to articulate here in Scranton, because I feel like a lot of people don't see that. And historically, like, we like to claim, like, Scranton was a part of the Underground Railroad, and, you know, we've had all these parts of being inclusive and working towards, like, racial equality, but you're holding on from something that is so long ago. But, like, what are other examples of our area being inclusive, that are being equitable, that are building communities in progress? We don't have that many examples of it, but you keep holding this one thing in this pocket, like, just wait, like, we're doing things, like, isn't that great and grand? Like, you can't hold that stamp forever. And I think that's something that we got to start thinking about, especially in areas like this, where people are very comfortable with what they see and what they're used to, even with it excluding other communities and people. So yeah, that's one thing that I really did, again, love about your book, is like, you give language to a lot of these concepts, a lot of these actual actions and places and instances, and we don't really take the time to think about it. The reason I had Julius read some excerpts and talk about his chapter on the Southern Free Black Theater, the Free Southern Black Theater, because I thought I really explained the way that activism and the Black freedom struggle is creative, and how we talk about our pain, we talk about our joy, we talk about places. And even as you mentioned before, like, bringing Black theater to wherever you are, whether it's in a cotton field, whether it's on someone's porch, whether it's just on 4 sidewalk blocks. This is our space now that we are reclaiming, and we're turning it into something. And I was saying to you before, although it's nowhere even near similar, but it kind of connects to me in a way. During the pandemic, when the Scranton Fringe Festival had the Porch Project, and we brought all of these, like, performances, community performances, to people's porches and to their homes. To me, I thought it was a really creative way of being expressive and telling our own stories in the way that we want to, with whatever resources we have available. And again, I mean, that was a community thing. It wasn't necessary to the Black community, but I felt like it's an example of how we reclaim our own spaces of where we're at, and we tell our stories how we need to tell them, to then get to this point of progress and movement. Because we can only, especially in the Black community, we can only use what we have, and oftentimes it's limited resources, it's piecemeal things, to then push a whole movement forward, to push beyond, like, patience and waiting. So I just thought that was a tie-in for me, because again, coming from a predominantly white space like Scranton, we're not telling these stories with the examples that you have from the Free Southern Black Theater. We may not have had that. And Scranton was very much a theatrical city. Like, we had in the 1920s, early 1900s, this was very much a theater and performance town. Minstrel shows came through here. We had Black minstrels. We did have Black performers, but not in the same way. And so it made me think in this chapter, like, what would have Black theater look like in Scranton? What would Black resistance look like? Have we actually had it there, but we just haven't taken the time to think about what that looked like? Was the Black community gathering and creating performances and plays? They absolutely were. They were using Bethlehem Church. They were using Shiloh. They were using people's homes to create performances of popular culture, reading the likes of Langston Hughes, Paul Laurence Dunbar, Negro spirituals, all types of Black culture of the era, and bringing it into whatever space they had. So while I was reading your book, that's what I was thinking about, trying to make those connections between just the Black experience nationally, and then what it could have looked like here.
Your comments actually make me, have you all seen on Twitter and Instagram, this kind of like, this is not your grandmother's civil rights movement?
Yeah.
And it annoys me to no end, right? Because just listening to you, what I hear is Black radicalism. There's a way in which, this kind of Twitter finger generation who thinks that radicalism is sending out a tweet and getting the most likes or whatever. They want to discount those stories that you're talking about, right? Even the Porch Festival that you're talking about, something like that brings Black people together, where we can celebrate ourselves, where we can have intellectual exchanges. Even something like the cookout, sometimes people are like, that's just Black people getting together and, like, having fun and partying. There are actual conversations that are happening at that cookout about politics, about current events, about people's healthcare. Oh, did you try this experimental new drug? Oh, I haven't tried that. Oh, it actually worked. It reduced my tumor, right? So this is more than just Black people having a cookout, as it were, right? And it's radical insofar as if that cookout actually saves a sister who's sort of on the edge and who doesn't want to know if she wants to live another day, and it saves her life. What's not radical about that? The definition of radicalism is going against the grain of the proper. right? And the proper suggests that black people's lives have no worth. This is the historical narrative in this country. So anything that gives value and worth to black life is radical. So part of what I want to do, and I get this a lot with my students who want me to kind of perform a different kind of radicalism, is, I tell them, I'm not going to be marching down, the street in College Park. That's not my kind of radicalism, but you certainly can. Well, when I got to Maryland, when I was in grad school, the Occupy Wall Street thing was going on. And I asked my advisor, should I be out here with I was the only black man in my PhD cohort, should I be out there with them marching down Market Street in Philadelphia? And my advisor said, the most radical thing you can do, Mr. Fleming, is to occupy your damn dissertation. And at the time I didn't understand it, but I can now actually cultivate generations of black scholars, undergrad scholars, and also PhD students because I finished that dissertation, right? So I think a part of the work of resistant black patients is that we have to stop having these contests around who's most radical and who's not, and to recognize our different kinds of radicalism.
Yeah.
Sometimes it might look like a march, sometimes it might look like a porch festival.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about the radical nature of black performance. So one of the things that I struggled with, because I agree and disagree, is this concept that black performance, the use of the black body and black performance is radical in its own nature, right? But on the other hand, and so that black performance is often, so I'm thinking, for example, of someone like Jordan Peele, right? That you see his movies and there's a lot more going on under the surface, but it's not secret. So that's why I struggle, right? So that here we have this space where I can be my authentic self and my audience understands me as my authentic self. But then there's this other part of the audience that I'm trying to hide from, right? But they can see the thing that I'm hiding. See where I'm going? I'm just kind of, I agree and I disagree, and I'm kind of in this uncomfortable space of how do we become, or how is black theatre, or actually black performance in itself, whether it's film, theatre, how does it become radical, or how is it radical without it being, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for.
Spectacle?
Yes!
Yeah.
Thank you, yes.
I said spectacle. Sorry, I said it low.
Yeah, I mean, so I study black performance, and it's a big question at the center of the field. Some people are really coming from my field, the field of black performance studies right now, particularly this group of scholars called Afro-pessimists. And their critique is that, part of what was happening is that people were saying, oh, look at black people performing that ballet dance, or look at, it got to the point people were saying, look at black people walking down the street whistling. That very act of walking and whistling is a radical act, right?
Or like black men frolicking, like that was all.
Yeah. And so some scholars are like, hold up, we're giving, we're reading too many things is radical. So I get that critique, and I get what you're saying about the limitations of it. I'm teaching a course now on black nightlife. It's called Welcome to the Party. I have to shout out my cousin who came with me because he's a rapper and he comes to speak in that class. But we start with the plantation, right? And we start with the plantation party. And we start with the cakewalk. And of course the cakewalk is a dance that the master looked at and said, oh, look at those slaves dancing, trying to mimic us because they want to be so much like white people. And the whole time the slaves it was satire. They were mimicking the ways of white folk, like saying, look how stupid they are trying to be hoity-toity on the plantation. So for me, that's the perfect example of the black body. So it's not an either or. Black performance can be conscripted, it can be monetized, it can be exploited as it has been, but it can also be a radical act, right? And I think what we have to do as scholars is to not fall into those easy paradigms of only radicalism or only oppression. It's usually somewhere in between, right? And Saidiya Hartman talks about it. She says that is betwixt and between, right? And I think that's the best way to think about it.
I think that's the hardest thing for students, right? That we need an answer, right? So here's my exam, I need an answer. So when it's that grey area, it does become really complicated and sometimes pretty frustrating. So.
Especially when this generation is used to multiple choice.
Yes, yes, which box do I tick?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Do you want to open the floor to the audience?
Yeah, well, there you go. See, anyway.
Do we want to do?
That'd be great.
Then you guys share it, okay?
I feel like we're projecting pretty good.
If you want to introduce yourself when you ask your question.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Amber Viola. Hi. My question is kind of in a realm of politics. And so when you think about the civil rights movement and the way that Dr. King worked with Johnson, and they were kind of frenemies, and they had kind of this dance where they went back and forth. But King used so many different types of mass media, press releases, press conferences, Southern Baptist conferences, talking to the president, working with different aides. Like, he kind of took it, you had sit-ins and jail-ins and all of these different things as a way to do activism, and it kind of gave people a way to do their own activism. You had the people that were marching, you had the people that wanted to do sit-ins, you had the people that were going to these Bible conferences and talking to people and preaching and things like that. So in today's sense of trying to get things like the John Lewis civil rights, the Voting Right Act, passed, and things like that, how can we take what they were doing and their movement and spreading it across all of these different things to really enact change, so that we aren't just patiently waiting, we're doing things and people are able to do things in their own arena? Because I get asked the question of, like, where are the Black leaders? Where are the leaders of the Black community? And what are they doing actively to try to, like, push these things? And I feel that too with myself, is like, okay, well, what can I do to help push that we have voting rights protections as a nation with Black people in it? Like, how do we do that? And how do we take a page out of the civil rights chapter to kind of do those things?
I feel like this answer is going to be disappointing. But I think it's
a mic.
It's strategizing. I think more than anything else, this is what civil rights activists did. They strategize. When I was researching for the book, there was this man. He was a legislator in Illinois. He had actually gone to my undergraduate institution. He was from Mississippi, graduated from Tougaloo, had a lot of power in Illinois. Was called the Jim Crow Buster. Right, that's just how powerful he was. And he wanted to celebrate the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation. Everybody was on board with it, right? But the problem is that to stage an event of this magnitude, you need hundreds of thousands of dollars. There were people from Madagascar coming, people from Mexico were coming. Where were they going to get that money? Black people certainly didn't have it in that way. They had to go to the state. So part of what he had to do was to actually negotiate with Republican legislators. And what that meant then is that Republican legislative body could then seek audits, and they could surveil the centennial planning, right? And so therefore you have your oppressors sort of right in the heart of your radical project. So I think a part of what we have to understand is that anti-Blackness and white supremacy are here to stay. They are ingrained in the DNA of this nation, right? And so what that means then is we have to ask a question in every context where we are: how do I navigate those structures of power? What are my demands? What do I want out of this? And how do I try to enact some kind of incremental change that can hopefully lead to structural change, right? I was at the University of Missouri 2 weeks ago giving this talk about this book. And there was a racist incident on TikTok. And the students had the president's ear, right? The president said, what can I do to help you? One version is you can just scream at the president and say how awful you are. Another version is to say, here are our deliverables. We need more Black faculty members. We need a better funded Black student resource center. We need more Black students. We need better graduate education providers. You see what I mean? So I think a part of my answer is that we can be kind of utopian or romantic in imagining the worlds that we want, but we also have to recognize the world that we have, and the world that we likely will have for a long time. And so knowing that, how do we move within this? I was just visiting the Black Scranton Project space, and Glynis was telling me about the story of that building, right? PNC is a bank, it's a corporation, right? It's a place that represents a certain kind of money power, right? And yet Glynis was able to get this space, and hopefully that space will open up more and more doors for Black people in Scranton. So I guess a part of my answer is that we have to negotiate and navigate those structures of power and be clear about the demands that we have to get what we want.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Julius did a great job, and you spoke really eloquently about some of the systemic issues that we go through. But I wanted to ask, how would you describe effective resistance in this day and age?
Affective or effective? Like
Effective resistance.
That's a small question. I mean, it's contextual. That's what I'll say. It's contextual. Sometimes, I'll say this now because I have tenure, I wouldn't have said this last year. Sometimes, that resistance, I remember my grandmother used to tell this story, and she grew up in Mississippi, and she was a sharecropper, and she lived on white people's land, as they called it. And the lady who owned the land used to call her the loud carry girl, the bad one. And one day she overheard this lady telling her mother, you need to shut that little young carry girl up, she's too loud. And so what my grandmother did was to go in front of the white lady's porch, and she stood there and she screamed as loud as she could, right? Once her mother went to the market. And I said, Granny, you weren't scared that this lady was gonna come off that porch and hit you? And she said, if Miss Lady had come off that porch, I was gonna throw her in the well. So she was strategically screaming by the well, ready to throw this lady over. So that's one form of resistance, right? But in my case, when I started my job at the University of Maryland, I was the only black man in the department, only black tenure track faculty in the department of 68 people. Right? And so what that meant is that all the black students at that campus of 60,000 students would come into me, save my life, help me with my class, and I was overworked, and much of that labor wasn't recognized. So what that meant in terms of my own resistance, for example, when people asked me to be on every diversity committee or to do this, that, and the other, I would ask them, oh, that sounds like an amazing opportunity. Thank you so much for thinking of me. Can you help me to think about how this will help me to get tenure and promotion? Right?
No, let me write that down.
So I could have said, oh, this is unfair, statistics show this, statistics, but my way of resisting was to actually invite you into seeing how messed up it is that you're asking me to do even more work. Yeah. Right? So I think it's contextual, and what we have to do is what we've always done as black people, we have to be inventive. We have to say, there is my goal, there is the thing that I want, and this is how I'm going to strategically get it. And I think we just have to do that based on every context we're in.
And we also have to start not being afraid to doing the things that you said. And I think that's part of the culture, to not say anything, to not ask questions, be grateful that someone even asked you to do something. And half the time it's not, because again, I know firsthand, and you probably know Black History Month, it should be something that we're celebrating and enjoying, but for Black scholars and activists and community leaders, we're the ones doing a lot of the work to make sure that we're pushing the culture forward. And it comes with a lot. And a lot of people just assume you're just gonna, well, yeah, just do it. What do you mean? And it's kind of not fair. And I think part of the work is being hey, listen, this is taxing, and it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be more labor and cumbersome and hard and exhausting for Black people to celebrate 1 month, even though it's all year, but we get this allocated month, but then we leave exhausted and burned out. And then we wonder why, we can't get anything done. It's because I feel like sometimes we're being grinded down, and we're not saying anything because it's disguised as looking like we're celebrating you, versus you're begging us to do all the work for you. So just put it out there. Maybe it's just me projecting.
Well, actually, that makes me think both of the things that you're saying, right? So one of the things that just occurs to me is this contemporary context of Black patients to kind of get at what you're talking about. To me, the cleverness of it is, well, look how far you've come.
Yeah.
Right? So whenever you complain about it, something, well, you're not a slave anymore. Also, what are you complaining about? And that to me is the cleverness of it today, that you can't be a complainer because look how far you've come. So yeah. I think that's a very clever way of, again, politicizing it in this way.
Absolutely. Look how far you've come.
Yeah.
Got a question here?
Hi, Norma Jeffries, a Scranton resident. And as I was looking at the title, I keep reading it over and over, Black Patients and Emancipation. And I keep thinking that it's a generational thing. Is it because, as I look at the pictures of the faces and the pictures that you have up there, they were working for the same thing, Black patients, emancipation. And here we are in 2023 talking the same thing. Those people in the picture are more than likely dead and gone, or they're not able to get out there and be an activist for it. So I was thinking that it's like a generational thing. So for those that were out there participating and trying to make a difference and make a change, so hopefully what they did doesn't get lost and we don't go back to square one and start all over again. So that's what I was thinking as I sat and looked and listened to you talk, because growing up in Scranton, we did not have this kind of history to look at. So it's just so great that the Black Scranton Project can open the eyes of people of my generation to see what's out there. So, it's just, I appreciate your discussion and your talk, and I just can't help but think that it's generational, and hopefully that the younger ones, like this little one here, will not have to wait until Black History Month to hear about our heritage.
Miss Norma didn't talk about her own activism. She's at city council almost every week, I guess.
I first want to thank you because this has been like really amazing for me, and just considering things that I have not considered as far as patients, and to think of history about like the space race and all of the money that was invested into that, and like we never even in our education got the idea that at the same time Black people were having to be so patient. That to me is frustrating, which I think is like obviously not my spot to be frustrated. And so I just ask you, like, and it might be too personal, but I'm just wondering, like, what are your feelings about, like, having to have Black patients, having to have that system? And also, like, when does it stop? Like, what is the solution to it? And I know that I'm sure, like, there isn't an easy one, but it's interesting to me, like, it seems like it's being built in now that we have to be patient for things, and I don't think that should be, but obviously we all don't, but I'm just wondering your thoughts on it.
Yeah, the question, when does it stop, I really don't know. But I think what we have to do is to fight like it will stop now, to borrow that language of now from the civil rights activists. There are moments when I'm optimistic, there are moments when I'm not. I think what we just have to keep in mind is that no change has been easy. And I think what I would say, how I would answer your question kind of primarily is we have to actually to your point in terms of generational, right? We have to actually be reflective and think about the change that has been made over time. And the change that people have been giving us that change, we fought for it, right? And so you all know Booker T. Washington, for example, and you all know how much people like to hate Booker T. Washington, right? He was an accommodationist, right? But working within those structures of power in the US South, in the immediate wake of slavery, this man was able to build an entire institution to educate recently free Black people, right? And so I think a part of what we have to do is to have, and I call it critical generosity, right? Which is to be critical of people like Booker T. Washington, or be critical of civil rights activists, or be critical of people like me who are professors and not marching in the street every day, right? And be critical but generous. To say, you've done this to resist Black patients, right? But these are some things you might do differently, or these are some other things you might look at moving forward. One of the things I talk about in the book is the sheer number of like queer civil rights activists in the civil rights movement, who people would think don't exist, because they had to be sidelined, right? There are cases in the archive, and I was writing the book, where there were allegations of rape against a white woman and rape against a white man by a Black man, a Black male civil rights leader. You know which one the court was more angry with? The queer one, not the white woman, right? Which is crazy in the South, because we know the main offense you commit in the South is rape a white woman, right? So there are all of these ways, and those people had to work not only against their Blackness being stigmatized, but also their queerness being stigmatized. There were women activists who were being raped during the civil rights movement, right? They weren't just sitting at lunch counters. So I think a part of what we have to do is to sit back and breathe and know that people are fighting for us. Even if they might not be on Twitter, they might not be the first one to run to the camera, but people are doing that work. And the hope is that somehow we'll culminate into some structural change.
Can I add to that a little bit? So one of the things that I've noticed now that I'm super old and teaching this for such a long time is that the incremental change is important in thinking about how to make change. So if you can say, this thing is better. So I teach advertising a lot, right? So when I grew up, there were no Black people in adverts, unless they were married, right? Or sort of crazy criminals. Now I turn on the television and I see Black people represented in every possible way. That is positive change. That then I hope that my students then think, this is how I can affect change by actually doing things, not just sitting there watching the TV show. I can go out there and make that advert. I can go out there and make that YouTube show and then make some change. But the thing that I also find that's super frustrating, and it goes back to the same thing. Now, I hate to use the word entitlement, every other moment, even if it was Emmett Till, they turned over the TV. They didn't buy that newspaper. They skipped over that. For me, in this moment, it feels like people, and maybe I'm just being too optimistic, but it feels like in this moment, people are not looking away, and that's what's making a difference. So if I'm going to keep looking, I'm going to see that that person is like me, and I'm going to empathize and have compassion, and then want them to be treated the same way. So I think it's that forcing myself to see is the thing that makes this feel like different.
I'll just add into that too. I think another layer that I'm hoping to see more of, and particularly from non-Black people, non-Black people of color, is to see more of like, okay, Black patients, we see Black people resisting or being vocal or stepping out of the space, but we also need to see white people either taking a step down and putting their hand out to give assistance, creating more space, or joining in the fight too, because you can't always, ask questions, like look for it too, like ask the questions and then look for the answer, and also be willing to give a hand, to give a support, because we do have way too many spectators. We're able to look away, but a lot of people didn't do anything either, and we all can't be spectators, and we can't expect all the people that are doing the work to do all of the work. And I think that's one thing that I always tell my students too, especially you can use hobby is, whatever your art is, and you can use that into your own form of activism. You don't have to be out in the streets, you don't have to be on Twitter, you don't have to be online, but you can use your pen, you can use your paintbrush, you can use your words, you can do anything, you can build something, you can help somebody, you can make a plate for somebody. These are ways that you can be an activist, so don't think it's not something that's unobtainable. And I just feel like sometimes people feel like being an activist means that responsibility. And I don't think it needs to be that. I think you can do your one little piece, and that one little piece actually does make a difference. So if that's anything you can carry away, like it could literally anything. If you like to sew some for somebody, or do anything. Like it's really honestly that simple. And the more we think about it as a simple task, it becomes a simple action. So
I just want to add quickly to your question about, will things change? Right now, a lot of my friends, a lot of my liberal-leaning friends, a lot of my progressive friends, there was real celebration, for example, when Joe Biden won, right? And it was somehow this indication that we really are the good people that we thought we were, right? And also when the congressional races turned out not to be the red wave that people were anticipating, there was a lot of, right? But I think what we also have to keep in mind is what's levels. So in Mississippi right now, the airport, which is run by Jackson, the blackest city in this country, there's a takeover being orchestrated by the state. There's a separate judicial system being established by the state so that the Capitol Police, which is under state jurisdiction, has priority over the local police, the primarily Black police. We see what is happening in Florida with the anti-woke laws, right? With African American studies curricula being pushed to the side, being put in the trash. We see what's happening with abortions, right? Even some of the programs that are designed for first generation college students that we've had for decades, they are being disbanded. You know why? Because those foundations are deathly afraid that conservative organizations are going to take them to the Supreme Court. And we know the constitution of that court. Right? So a part of what I'm saying is that even as we have these national moments of progress, we have to look at what's going on the local level. And if we look at the indications, it's not good. It's not good for what's going on with women's bodies. It's not good with what's going on for Black folk. It's not good with what's going on with anti-union laws for workers, right? And so I think we really have to look at those local politics to see really where this country is going, especially in places like Scranton. Because I can tell you in Mississippi, a lot of towns like this, the Black people have left. But in terms of who gets sent to Congress, they still have the same amount of power, right? More and more minority people are being concentrated in urban areas, which means that states are being left behind to be another kind of political constitution, right? So part of what I'm saying is we have to look at the local and state levels, because I think that's where the real kind of test of what this country will come in the next decade.
Rose Daniels here. I'm absolutely just enamored by all of this knowledge and information that you're sharing with us tonight. And what I wanted to bring up was, the perpetual cycles of like being Black and wanting to see this change happen. So you go through these cycles of getting motivated, getting out, doing the work, then you get burnout, then you get a little depressed per se. You see the faces of the people in your community on a daily basis and what you're fighting for, but you still feel that loss of that fuel to keep you going. And I wanted to kind of speak on that and ask you guys, what do you think about that? How do you think that Black people who are out on the front lines can stay motivated, stay, energized? And we know it's kind of impossible to stay energized, but what are some of your tactics and advice to, keep activists and people who are fighting for equality and all this change to, keep their motivation?
I would say definitely so I would say first and foremost, as something I've been exploring more, is that rest itself is a form of resistance. And there's a few scholars and colleagues that are working on writing about that now currently. But as Black people, think about it. Like, we were never allowed to rest. It didn't matter how tired you were. Do the work. So that's an active form of resistance right there, deciding to rest, take a break. And I know it's hard. Like, we can't always do that. But that would be my first thing to say there. And then also, too, like, lean on and call on your colleagues and other fellow activists and talk about these things. Because, again, like, you're not the only person we have these conversations, but, we're not the only people going through it. And we have to remind ourselves that we are a collective, because even if we feel like we're on the front lines alone, in itself we aren't. So we have to remind ourselves that we have this community. And also, too, bring someone in, call on another hand here. Where are our allies at now? Look around. Are they on the front lines with you? But then recruit one, because there's plenty of white people that I feel like I recruit all the time to be allies. Like, you're gonna step up with me, yes, that's the answer. So I think just for me too, one thing I'm also learning to do as an activist is asking for more help, like to the point where it almost feels exhaustive. Because I think too, with a lot of, especially Black activists, we kind of feel like we have to do a lot of things on our own, because either people won't do the work with you, or just won't do the work. So you have to, like, you're the one that's like, I'm the go-getter, I'm the person to get it. And that's what brings out a lot of us. So I think we need to try a little bit harder to, like, ask for help when we really need it, call on our fellow activists, but then also make the radical active decision to rest. Regardless of if people tell you you can't right now, do it. And I'll tell you, like, I do it. And I do a lot of things, but I definitely have to remind myself, like, girl, you gotta chill, you gotta sit down, you gotta take a break, you gotta rest, because it's not sustainable. And especially as you are building community, you're building progress, you have to take a break. Rome wasn't built in a day. Pyramids weren't built in a day. Like, all these things require rest. We're only human, we're only people at the end of the day. No one is a superhuman. Maybe there are some out there, but at the end of the day, we all need to kind of feed into ourselves and rest. So that's my answer.
And I like self-care to that too.
And self-care.
Have another question here?
Hi, Dr. Fleming. Welcome to Scranton. I did not know that the definition of patience involves suffering, but after hearing that, a lot of stuff makes sense now. I really appreciate that. I wanted to ask you about political moderates in the context of Black patience, because if we're talking about Black patience, political moderates become central to that, and especially because they get a lot of praise for being in the middle of the road, being reasonable. And certainly white supremacists get a lot of headlines, extremists get a lot of headlines, but it seems like political moderates become the fuel that makes Black patience necessary. So I was wondering, how should we understand political moderates within the context of Black patience?
As they say in Mississippi, they sure don't ask easy questions in Scranton. I think if we talk over drinks, I might have I'm not a political scientist, but what I'll say is that just looking at what's happened in Congress recently, right? I think there was a moment where there was more kind of like bipartisan interaction in this country. We're clearly not there now. So actually being what's called a political moderate can be more dangerous to my very being. While it might kind of score you political points or get you reelected, but there are major things hanging in Congress right now that actually depend on my existence, right? And to be a political moderate, whether it's ideological or whatever it is actually dangerous and can be irresponsible. When you look at black people, I think who have historically been sort of political moderates, there's a way history where they can kind of on the face of things be moderate, but then behind scenes be the most radical person that you can think of. And I think, of course, the person I'm thinking about here is Dr. King, right? There's a way in which people digest him as a political moderate, they rehash him as a political moderate, but when you really go and look at his writings and his speeches and the conversations he was having with people, you get a very different version, right? So I think when I encounter black people who kind of give the appearance of being political moderates, and what I've noticed, I've seen colleagues at the university, I don't know if you all have seen this, right? They'll start off as like a faculty member, and it's like they're super cool, and we're having all the like radical conversations and talking about the structure of power. Then they'll become like associate dean, and they're less like cool. They're quiet, then they're the real dean, then they're the provost, and then it's just like, well, things take time, right? While I'm mad at them, I get it, right? Because I think a part of what I'll end with this, when you have a closer seat to the face of power, you really understand the fight that's ahead, and that I think necessarily forces you to moderate your politics in interesting ways, if that makes any sense.
Should we do one last question with
Any last
Carolyn
question?
right here?
Oh, we have one in the
We
back.
have one back here.
Yep.
And also to Glynis's point about rest, I think that is actually the most radical thing that's been said today. Get some rest, because the point is that black activists die prematurely, black professors die prematurely, black people die prematurely in general. And sometimes, my colleagues will say, hey, can you do this thing? And I'll say, oh my God, I'm sorry, I have a previous engagement. And that engagement is literally watching Family Feud. But I put it on my calendar because that's my rest.
Good evening, everyone. Hi, my question is for the young lady in the middle. I'm curious to know, with this being a predominantly white area here in Scranton, what has been your experience with these courses, and your has it been positive? Your experiences dealing with a predominantly white area, trying to kind of get that kickback, those things kind of rolling for the black residents of Scranton.
So as a native Scrantonian, I can say that there wasn't a lot of the literature that you were talking about coming into like bringing things to the area. I feel like there has been kickback, but there also has been a sense, and I'm only speaking to Scranton, not Northeastern PA generally, but I do feel like there has been a sense of acceptance and wanting to be inclusive. For example, with the Scranton School District, them inviting me to read children's books, and you invited me to read children's books, I'm only reading black children's books, number one. And then two, asking me like, what books can we incorporate into our library? For those who don't know, all of the arts are being cut. So like a lot of the teachers are just pulling in their own resources for that. So to answer your question on that front, I kind of feel like it's open and accepting to create change. In terms of the University of Scranton, some of you guys are familiar, I brought some topics back to light because I felt like it's important to mention the history of the school's racism on campus. And how do we change that? If we want to talk about making this campus more inclusive and open and comfortable to black folks, we have to reconcile, some of the activities here that were racist and made it uncomfortable for students to either want to come here or to continue to come here today. And so we are very open to that, which kind of spawned part of this project and the work that the university is doing and the historical research and archiving that we're doing here on campus. So yes, I think it has been receptive, and I think our area in particular is slowly doing the work to bring change. Hiring more faculty of color on campus here has been really great, and other universities in the Scranton area are also trying to do that. But I do think there's still a lot of work to be done, especially in Pennsylvania, but luckily a lot of that is changing, but in Northeast Pennsylvania specifically, so.
I think as an educator, I think one of the things that's important to point out is the thing that you're doing that I love, bring someone with you, right? So go to an event, bring a friend with you, let them learn about the things just by seeing and being. And I've been to a couple of local events, and that's what I've seen, is people bringing their kids, right? So that you can make change. Infusing it right now, like no matter how young you are, infusing the idea that we are all one people as opposed to
Final.
Good evening, everyone. Dr. Fleming, I thank you for speaking so much about the topic. But one thing that you talked about was how, the younger, like I'm concerned about the younger generation coming up. Many times we see on TikTok or many times we see on Instagram, like it's a trend to just be out there marching, or it's a trend to be out there doing a movement. Like anybody can read a textbook or regurgitate information in a whole bunch of people. And then you mentioned that, a lot of people get likes. What advice do you have for us? Because again, I'm thinking about my own family that I have to raise growing up. I know a lot of other people are thinking about, their kids and their kids, future generations. How do we make sure that, being an activist doesn't just become a trend rather than, people actually putting in the work and wanting change?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think for me, it's just about the thing I ask myself is, does this work that I'm doing have a chance of leaving this world better than I found it? And that then opens the door for my work to look a whole lot of ways. So some of my colleagues in my generation, they're the Twitter people, right? They have these huge followings on Instagram, Twitter, and it pays off because that exposure gets them invitations to give lectures and talks. And so it's also profitable financially, right? What I have to remind myself is that when I have a group of 3 Black students who are seniors in undergrad and they want to go on and get the PhD, and I'm going through their thesis and I'm reading their resume and I'm asking them, what did you do with this internship, so that I can write a strong letter of recommendation. Because I realized that I work at the University of Maryland, and they're going to be competing against people who have letters of recommendation from Harvard, from Princeton, and from Yale. So I take that energy and say, how do I write this letter for this Black student that will tell the people who make these decisions, they will get this PhD. That sometimes takes me 2 weeks. And I have to remind myself that that is as much a part of the freedom struggle as those people marching in the street.
I would tell you, Joyce, to educate. That's my big thing. Read. The more you read, if you think about the generation of the 1960s, how dangerous they were because they were the most educated generation we saw in the US, right? So, in yourself, refusing to be ignorant, refusing to be told a narrative of Black inferiority and Black poverty, that's how you can change. And then you share that with your friends, right? You start having these conversations about the ways in which you are different from the stereotypes that are put out there. And then you, and I think, and I know it's because I'm a teacher, but education, reading is to me is the biggest key to affecting any kind of change. And you mentioned Frantz Fanon, the autobiography of Malcolm X, autobiography of Angela Davis. These are some books that you can walk away with knowing that will help you understand not just your place in the world, but other people's places. And then the other thing that is really, I think, we didn't touch on, racism affects everybody, right? And we see the way that racism affects poor people in this country, poor whites particularly. So it makes no sense to continue racism because we all suffer so badly as a result of it. And yet we continue to do it because it's easier than the fear of change. But this is not my talk.
I've been here part of the panel. Okay, any final comments?
Just thank you, Julius. Thank you, Melissa. And thank you, Julie, over here.